Thinbin, how would you define love? I think a classic move from the material to the spiritual. Gertrude Stein wants to see the stretch marks on my tongue. I taste a familiar drop of bitter in the back of my throat. I point to a table on which several quinces sit yellowing in a blue and white china bowl. I shake my head in their direction, and I leave the room, speechless. Quinces are ripe, Gertrude Stein, when they are the yellow of canary wings in mid-flight. They are ripe when their scent teases you with the snap of green apples and the perfumed embrace of coral roses. But even then, quinces remain a fruit, hard and obstinate. Useless, Gertrude Stein, until they are simmered, coddled for hours above a low, steady flame. Add honey and water, and watch their dry, bone-colored flesh soak up the heat, coating itself in an opulent orange, not of the sunrises that you never see, but of the insides of tree-ripened papayas, a color you could taste. To answer your question, Gertrude Stein, love is not a bowl of quinces, yellowing, seen but untouched. Those are the words of Monique Truong in the Book of Salt, and this is The Red Pen.
You ready, bud?
Oh. Good timing.
Hell.
I was ready. Thank you for asking. Hello, Amanda. Welcome back to the Red Pen. I mean, I guess you were here already. It's really our listeners that we're welcoming back to the Red Pen, where we cut up fiction to see what it's made of. I saved it. Did you hear me save it?
I did. I bore witness to your saving, as did our listeners. Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm the co-host, and this is Austin's episode.
It's my episode. I'm Austin Chant. It's all about me.
Last episode was yet another installment of the Chant Show, because we had Laura Chant, and then the week previous we also had Christopher Chant.
Yep.
And so the chant this week is just you, so you got to ride this whole thing.
Yeah, there are sadly no more chants in this episode, which I'm very excited about. But first, I think we have a Snowmageddon update to give.
Yeah, we promised the people.
Snowmageddon update. It is now, not to give you a peek behind the curtain here, but it is Tuesday, the 12th of February.
July.
Of July. I fucking wish. A lot of snow has fallen on Seattle. My power did go out, although only for about 5 hours.
Oh.
A lot of snow still is out there, and a lot of ice still out there.
I definitely ordered sandwiches today because the apps let me. And when my poor person came to drop off my sandwiches, I definitely had to push their car because it got stuck in the snow.
I didn't have any incidents when I ordered food, but I did tip them $10 because I felt really bad. You
needed that chicken. That chicken was extremely important.
Really need fried chicken.
Chickening.
I've done a good job of cooking for myself during the last 5 days in which I haven't left the house because I refused to go outside in the snow. You know what? Sometimes you really need fried chicken.
The chickening had to commence, and it did. Especially because you had ordered chicken before, and then they canceled the order. And
I canceled the order because I made the order, and then it started snowing so hard that I was afraid that if I didn't cancel the order, I was gonna, see
Kill
someone die on the hill outside of my house, and I would come outside, and it would just be, blood and fried chicken soaking into the snow.
So Southern Gothic, except for the snow.
It's a fusion cuisine. I have been getting some good reading done, though, in this snowpocalypse. I'm currently reading Salt Magic, Skin Magic, which is very good. And I just finished Any Old Diamonds by KJ Charles.
Yes.
Predictably.
I read that the night it came out, and I've been waiting with bated breath for all of my fucking slow-ass friends.
I know.
I'm always done first.
What have you been reading?
Well, I went on a bender because I have a Goodreads account and you can create a yearly reading challenge. And I did not meet, last year I set it for 100 and I did not meet it. And this year I set it for, I think 75 or something, 80 maybe. And I was like, I'm going to start my year out right. I'm going to read a lot. And I started reading a lot. And then I read something I didn't really like. And then I tried to wash the taste out of my mouth by reading like 3 other books in the same night, and I'm kind of burned out. So I read some cute shifter books by R. Cooper. I read the KJ book, and then I read a lot of Detroit Become Human fan fiction because that's who I am as a person.
It's the least surprising thing you've ever said to me.
It's very on brand. When I was first starting to find Detroit Become Human fan fiction, I thought for sure I would like something wholesome and beautiful, but no, I'm just all about that filth.
Again, the most surprising thing ever said by Amanda.
Amanda Jean.
Filth
who
lover.
Loves only pure robots. Androids. They're not robots. I know the difference. Mm-hmm. And at one point, I'm going to torment Austin by coming over to his house when it's not like Snowmageddon 2019. And I'm going to play some of, if not all of, Detroit Become Human on his PlayStation and make him watch me do it while he does other stuff while giving running commentary of the bad choices that game made. This isn't really so much a wholesale endorsement of that game so much as it is an acknowledgement that I love androids and they're in the game and they're pretty and I like them.
There you go. So this episode is not about Detroit Become Human.
I'm leaving.
Although future episodes may be. Who knows? This episode is one that I'm very excited to do because this was one of the first things that popped into my mind when we got the idea for this podcast. Because I'm going to talk today about a book I've written an academic paper about that I really liked. I'm going to talk about 2 books, but the one that inspired this is The Book of Salt by Monique Truong, which is both of these are literary fiction with a capital L, like literary fiction. The Book of Salt is about a Vietnamese immigrant to Paris who winds up staying in the home of Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein as their chef. And the other book, which I'm going to compare and contrast it with, is The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. I am going to insist we say the full title of every time in this episode.
I'm going to insist that I never do that.
By Ron Hansen, which is as you might imagine, a book about the outlaw Jesse James and
his assassination.
His assassination by the good boy,
hands.
Robert Ford.
By Austin's son.
By my son, Robert Ford.
I got to hear a lot about Robert Ford and how he's a good boy who was trying his best and is maligned, and Jesse James was a piece of shit, so it didn't matter anyway.
I'll say Bob Ford, probably not a great boy, did some weird shit in his life, but he was 20 years old.
He was a baby.
Anyway, so...
We'll get to that. I will interrupt you to say real quick, I love how to follow on the heels of this is our 5th podcast episode for the Red Pen. Hey, every day we drift further from God's light, and by God's light I mean popular listenership.
A listenable podcast. Yeah, listen, I know y'all are here because you want to hear about the stuff I wrote academic papers about in college. You're all nerds.
The way that I look at this podcast is Austin and I really like weird things and tell each other about them. And we're doing you the misfortune of recording it so that you can hear it too. So just know that...
I can't believe you're nagging our podcast.
It's very on brand for me. Our beautiful podcast that we're trying to make unlistenable. I remember when Austin first read The Book of Salt and just the sheer, white-knuckled awe and enthusiasm and just, breathless, and then this metaphor. So I'm really excited to see how on earth Austin is managing to combine what I believe is a giant food metaphor with the assassination of a bad boy. So let's
I
feel
like I should actually, since you outed me in this way, be a little more upfront about the fact that I fucking love both of these books. That's true of everything on this podcast for the most part, but I love these books and love them in a way where the entire time I've read them, I can't shut up about them. And I'm constantly just sort of sitting there the beauty.
Good imitation of yourself.
When I was in college, the class that I read The Book of Salt for was a course on literature that deals with sexuality. It's a queer book. This was a class, there were a lot of upper level literature courses in my college that were attended by people who weren't ready for an upper level literature course, shall we say. And
Sounds like college.
Don't mean that to be a dick, but like I'm normally try to be very chill with like, yeah, people like different things, and a book that is an extremely ornate food metaphor maybe isn't for everyone. But everybody who doesn't like this book is wrong. And
I'm offended. Mm-hmm.
Wrong and ignorant. And then I read all the Goodreads reviews of it, and anytime there was a negative one, I sat there and just picked it apart and was like, they're wrong.
Seethed.
I seethed. It is so beautifully constructed. I'm going to get into it. Anyway, the reason that these two books are together, though, because they're not necessarily the most unlikely partners, is that they have a couple things in common. One, they're both sort of revisionist histories. Not revisionist in the sense that it's a fantasy space AU of what if the Civil War,
what if
but
Jesse
on Mars,
James was in
whatever.
space?
Yeah. But in the sense that they tell the stories that are not told generally. So both of them take a well-known figure, Jesse James or Gertrude Stein, and then tell the story of someone who was sort of in that person's shadow. And they make a very, very compelling case for that person being an equally fascinating protagonist. And they also are both extremely beautifully written with like very, very lush memoirs. They're both historical fiction that does an amazing job of taking you to the place that beautifully researched, like exquisitely researched, really, really good at making something that is historical feel real. In that way, I think they challenge sort of dominant narratives in a really interesting way as well, because they don't challenge those narratives from a modern perspective. They challenge them from like a very intimate perspective. They're like, no, we're going to go and sit alongside these historical figures and portray them in many ways that are, you know, sympathetic and close, but also that exposes them. And my neighbors are just pounding their little feet into the floor above my head.
I heard that. I literally heard that. Incredible. One of the other things that I think is interesting about this episode is that you are basically talking about very unique, interesting, and well done fan fiction.
Yes. I should also say, I mean, these are technically RPF if you get
real
down
person
to
fiction.
It. And I think that's beautiful.
I love it too. I also think it's interesting that this is one of the few subgenres of fan fiction that's been quote unquote legitimized in mainstream publishing.
Mm-hmm.
Tie-in novels, yeah, because they're officially licensed, and historical narratives about real people or real events that are fictionalized in some way. Those are legit, but
well, it really does show
someone's One Direction fanfic isn't.
I think it really does speak to just the different ways that different genres are perceived. The notion that doing a huge depth of historical research to dive into the mind of a dead person from many, many years ago is literary fiction, but fanfic is not. Yeah, anyway, makes you think.
Why isn't all of that research I did on the Jonas Brothers in 2009 winning awards?
Amanda, the people can't know this about you.
The people will know everything about me. Every bad thing. Actually, I kind of want to replace that with something a little less awful.
What do you got? What do you got up your sleeve?
Zachary Quinto. That's what I've got up my sleeve.
Okay.
No, that's not true. I feel like I really like historical figures and I really like history, so I tend to go on topic binges where I really heavily research historical figures. I feel like that's happened, but I don't know that I've spent as much time obsessing over them as I have more contemporary figures like mainstream actors, musicians, etc.
Yeah.
It's funny. I wonder if one day there will be an opus all about Harry Styles.
From the perspective of someone in 100 years being like, who was Harry Styles really? And who was the man who betrayed him?
Why did Christopher Nolan put him in a movie? These are the questions.
I can't wait. Oh man, I want to travel to the future and just read weird books that people write about our contemporaries.
I'm really actually excited to get older and find out what fictionalized interpretations of the 2000s, 2010s and 2010s are going to be like, because I'm already seeing fictionalized versions of the 90s, which I vaguely remember. And I'm like, ooh, that's not quite right. This is Uncanny Valley. And I love it.
Boy, we're giving them some wild material to work with, huh?
Yeah. I see, on one hand, I would love even like the most bottom of the rung, like that 70s show, like that 2000s show would be good. But instead, I think we're just going to give them like really intense 10-hour documentaries.
Yeah.
That you have to watch to like understand. It's like World War II in full color, and it's like 2019 in full color. Everything's bad.
2019 now in 5D. Whatever that is.
We pump smells into the room. It's mostly Starbucks.
I have to say, I'm just going to cut in here to be pretentious because that is my goal for this episode. The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford is probably the best book I've ever read for lines of dialogue and prose that literally do evoke actual smells and feelings.
Ooh.
Like, there was a line I read, and I think this is partially because I'd just come back from Texas and I was missing that, but there was a line about, like, the cooling off of a hot day, like, somewhere very warm, and it was so literally, like, I got chills because it made me feel that thing.
Ooh, it cooled
and I was
you
like,
off.
damn.
I'm always so impressed when books can actually evoke physiological responses or hit the nail on the head so perfectly in terms of senses, because frequently it feels like set dressing to me. So when something is actually evocative, I'm like, oh, how'd you do that?
Yeah. Damn, I actually don't remember whether this was Monique Truong or Ron Hansen. It was an interview with one of them where they were speaking about prose as character in their books. And I think that's absolutely true of both of these, and is something that, like, if that's a thing you're into, these are authors to check out, because that is, like, their whole thing. So I'm just going to dive into the Book of Salt here. The Book of Salt is, you told me I should give some context for Gertrude Stein, and I will. So Gertrude Stein, I think many people will be familiar with as a figure in Western literary canon. She is an author and poet, and she was active at the same time that a lot of the modernists were. She famously, with her life partner Alice B. Toklas, hosted a literary and arts salon in Paris at their home for many years that was attended by people like Picasso and Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald. And the list goes on and on, honestly. If I pulled up like who hung out at that salon, it's a very long list.
It's a who's of that decade.
Yeah, it became very, very influential in sort of defining the modernists and defining a literary canon and also an arts canon. She and her partner were also, and her brother were also art collectors. This was their salon was their home, and it was just filled with artists of the period. And people would come and do portraits there. If you've seen Midnight in Paris, there are scenes set in their historic home. I don't think it's on set, like in their historic home, actually. I don't know. That setting was one that was very important to a lot of, you'll read about it in like Hemingway's memoirs. He talks a lot about being there, and it defined a lot of those relationships. Also, she was a big gay.
That, I feel like that is important.
I feel like everyone should know. Gertrude Stein, definitely a big lesbian. So that setting is one that is important to sort of the literary canon. And then she wrote a number of, she wrote her, I think maybe her most famous book is the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is largely set in that home and is a weird book set. It's about her partner, but written from her partner's perspective.
That's a weird thing to do.
It's a weird thing to do, and very much sort of weird things. What?
Weird things.
Very much in line with the kind of weirdness that Gertrude Stein got up to. This is my sidebar. I'm not a huge fan of Gertrude Stein's writing because it was kind of surrealist stream of consciousness.
Yeah, that's not my favorite either.
I have an excerpt that I do want to read, though, because this was the first short story I ever read by Gertrude Stein. Miss Fur and Miss Skeene, if you are familiar. You'll, it is possibly the origin of a particular word. It is possibly the origin of a particular context of a queer word that y'all might know and love. Here's the excerpt. They were regular in being gay. They learned little things that are things in being gay. They learned many little things that are things in being gay. They were gay every day. They were regular. They were gay. They were gay the same length of time every day. They were gay. They were quite regularly gay.
Is that the name of our episode?
Maybe so. This was a story about lesbians, but it was written before the word gay became popularly known.
Common parlance,
Common parlance for homosexual. I cannot imagine that it was not influential in getting that new meaning of that word established.
Off the ground?
Yeah. So that's Gertrude Stein. In either... I don't remember if it was in... Alice B. Toklas was a very accomplished cook and wrote a cookbook. And I believe it is in that it is mentioned that Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas had a Vietnamese chef. And Monique Truong, the author of the Book of Salt, read this and was inspired by this character, or this person who... I don't even remember if he was named, but the idea that, like, he must also have a story that is worth telling. I think I have a quote here. She wrote, "I was, to say the least, surprised and touched to see a Vietnamese presence, and such an intimate one at that, in the lives of these two women. These cooks must have seen everything, I thought. But in the official history of the lost generation, these Indo-Chinese cooks were just a minor footnote. There could be a personal epic embedded in that footnote. No. There could be a personal epic embedded in that footnote, I thought. The Book of Salt is that story."
Yes. God, the kernels of inspiration, they come from everywhere.
I know.
Sometimes even footnotes.
So the Book of Salt is about a Vietnamese man, a gay man, who winds up immigrating to Paris and working as a chef there. And it is largely about his internal life and his relationship with his family and his relationship with being an immigrant and experiencing racism from his employers, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. And I just find and so he is a brilliant chef, and the entire book is very much told through food and his relationship to food as a means of expression that can transcend the language barriers that he's facing, and that can also sort of transcend more broadly cultural barriers and interpersonal barriers. It is one of the most densely metaphorical books I think I've ever read. The quote that I read at the beginning, I particularly love, and I wanted to talk it over and give some context for it. That's the quote about the quinces being ripe in the bowl. This chapter is about how he has coped with struggling to speak French, and the ways he has coped with missing vocabulary by defining things in the negative, really very deftly, managing to describe things by being like, not that, not that, not that, but yes, that. When he's, having to go shopping for his employers and cook for them or like describe things to them. In his internal narrative, you're seeing like that he has this incredibly deep and rich monologue going on and the depth of his knowledge. But on the surface of it, you're getting him sort of taunted by his employers. On the surface, you're seeing him sort of belittled and mocked because he does not speak fluent French. Gertrude Stein is playing these sort of cruel games with him to try to see what words doesn't he know, which amuses her as a writer. And you have this sequence where she asks him to define what love is, knowing that as a vague concept is going to be really hard for him. And he points to the bowl of quinces and walks out, and then later sort of builds on this really rich metaphor for what love is as he is flirting with dudes and really wanting them to like come into his life and touch him and be with him and not just sort of be unseen or unrecognized as a queer person. Builds this really, really lush metaphor and then tops it off by the last line, like defining it in the negative, like love is not that. And it's just this big, like, fucking mic drop. I love this book.
Literary mic drops.
Yes. I lost my train of thought. I'm literally sweating because I love this book so much.
I've been there. It's a rough place to live.
It's rough. But yeah, and I think it's just a beautiful and challenging book because it takes you into something that could be utopian, like, oh, this immigrant chef winds up in Paris and manages to wander into the household of two historic lesbians, and he's queer, and they're all happy together, and it's like, it constantly pushes back against that. It portrays, I think, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas in a very intimate and loving way, but it also shows like they never recognize him for who he is because they can't see past their own prejudice and their own biases and their own racism. And it's a very lush and beautiful book that is also very challenging to, you know, ideas of queer solidarity or queer universal anything that really speaks to the fact that you need to actually be able to see someone as a person before you can have that. It is a stunning book.
I'm so glad I get to hear about it vicariously because I want to read it, but it's also like, when?
It's long and very dense. It's not like super long. It's like a normal book length, but it's so dense. Like I remember I have sympathy for the people who complained about it in my college classes. I say that with gritted teeth because it was a lot to read in like a couple weeks with class going on, and it is hard to understand if you're skimming.
Yeah, I imagine the spot reading that most people do, myself included, is not aiding the experience of comprehension in any way.
No. I would sit like lovingly curled around the book, like reading it one line at a time and going, ooh, beautiful.
I remember.
And I imagine not everyone was on board with that.
Just like, oh my God, another fucking fruit metaphor. Okay, we're strapping.
It's
Is
fruit
this
again.
Strawberries this time? Is it papaya? Which fruit? Are we going to go through every fruit? Tomato next? What's up?
Yeah. But I love it because it is, again, in my last episode about magic systems, I talked a lot about how cool it is when you have a magic system that tells you a lot about a character. And the thing I love about this book is you have a metaphorical setting and a metaphor woven throughout that also tells you a whole lot about the character. It's first person, so it really couldn't be from the perspective of someone who doesn't know this much about food and who doesn't sort of frame their life through it as well. And all of the things around food, like the experiences of eating with people and the experiences of preparing food for people. All those things are really integral to the book. It's a good book. So, the other one that I wanted to talk about, obviously, we know what it is. Hang on, I'm taking a drink of water.
Your segue. You want to talk a little bit about...
I just want to give you some fucking bloopers to work with, Amanda.
Gulp more. That's a blooper.
Mm.
Wow, that was a particularly horny noise.
Why did you say that while I was drinking?
I didn't know.
I almost spat on my mic.
Ooh, bad.
Which would have been
times.
another great horny noise.
Done with horny noises. Let's talk about the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford.
Thank you for giving it the full title that it deserves.
I addressed it professionally. With respect.
Yeah, it's not respectful to refer to it as the assassination of... Fuck.
The assassination of Jesse James.
The assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is similarly positioned. So this is funny. When I first read this book, which was quite recently, I was looking up just like great books in the Western canon because I was going to Texas. Damn it.
Austin has an affair with Texas, as if you could not tell from his first name.
Yeah, and so I was looking that up, and I saw the book recommended as like a, read this if you want to have complex feelings about anti-heroes or like learn about the villain of the story and blah, 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 what makes them compelling. And I was like, all right, sounds good.
Sounds like your jam.
Yeah, and then I was reading it, and I was like, man, this book is not selling me on Jesse James as a person. It's kind of doing the opposite of that. And then because I didn't really grow up with that story or really the legacy of Jesse James, I didn't realize until near the end of the book that the anti-hero being referred to is in fact Robert Ford.
Actually, much like I made you talk about who Gertrude Stein was, can we talk a little bit about Jesse James, the fucking, like, basically Confederate outlaw asshole? Yes.
So Jesse James is sort of a outlaw figure in the Western canon. He was a bank and train robber, among other things. Yeah, and he lived, born in 1847, died in 1882. He was a Confederate jackass. I'm just quoting from Wikipedia right now because I have it open. You can read more about shitty things done by Jesse James if you wanna, but he was part of a pro-Confederate guerrilla group during the Civil War, participated in atrocities against Union soldiers and abolitionists and massacres of that kind. But Jesse James is remembered as sort of this, like, Robin Hood figure.
Unfucking believably,
Yeah,
yes.
like, rob from the rich, give to the poor. Side note, he did not do that ever.
Kill abolitionists, take all their money.
Yeah, he didn't really do any charitable work. He murdered at least 12 people, maybe more, that weren't definitively proven to have been him. He stole a lot of shit. He killed a lot of people. And he was kind of a weird dude, by all accounts. But this legacy of him endured such that the coward Robert Ford, Bobert, let's call him Bobert.
Your loving
boy
nickname
Bobert.
for your son is Bobert. Bobert Chant.
The coward Robert Ford.
I'm dying. Something about you having a child named Bobert or Chan is fucking
Bobert
giving
Chant,
me life.
my boy.
Bobert.
Bobert, you get down from there.
Bobert, it's time out. Okay.
Anyway.
Go back to the book.
So my boy Bobert.
I'm almost done, I swear.
So about my son.
Robert.
Robert Ford.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse James is remembered so fondly. Even I think this is an interesting sort of. Still thinking about Bobert, huh?
Oh my god.
Are you all right?
No. Okay.
Jesse James was remembered so fondly. Even, I keep saying remembered, even at the time, I think partially because this was a time before, like cameras. I mean, there were cameras, but there was like, you got all day to set up a thing and then you get maybe one of them. Cameras and newsreels, like the stories that were told of him, even in contemporary terms, were often made up. Often, it could just be wholesale lies of like, I heard that Jesse James kissed 20 orphans and then like shot a bad man and took all his money and gave it to the starving orphans. And
yeah, he was a folk hero.
Yeah, he was a folk hero and a trash man.
Yeah, he was fucking gross.
So even more than, the Book of Salt is a challenge to the legacy of Gertrude Stein, the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is a strong challenge to that legacy because it portrays him as a weird dude. And a very interesting person, but ultimately like a deeply flawed one who did terrible things. And when he was finally killed, it was by a 20-year-old recruit of his gang who shot him in the back in his home, then attempted
kind of a boss move, sorry.
Oh, it was kind of a boss move. And honestly, I would challenge you to read this book and not be sitting there like, get it, Bobert?
No, you had to say it. You fucking had to say it. You had to say your son's name.
Robert Ford was a really interesting person because he was a huge Jesse James fanboy who knew everything about him and had been very influenced by the stories that were told about him, and then got into his gang and was like, shit.
I thought we were gonna kiss orphans and give them money.
Yeah, by all accounts, probably Jesse James was going to kill him. So it was, you could make an argument for self-defense for my son, Bobert Ford. He left behind this really interesting legacy because for the rest of his life, he, the title of the book comes from a folk song at the time that was about oh, poor Jesse James was murdered by the coward Robert Ford who shot him in the back, who deserves to die, basically. Ford himself contributed to that legacy in an interesting way by making a lot of his living for years after that by performing shows like I Killed Jesse James. Here's my
Ask
account
me how.
of it. Yeah, literally AMA. I shot Jesse James, but this is wild. I won't go into the whole thing because you can read the book and it's fascinating. But he and his brother who was also in Jesse James's gang, put on a show where like his brother played Jesse James and Robert like killed him over and over and over again. And that was psychologically weird for them.
That must have been very strange for their sibling dynamic. And also what a weird way to live. Mm-hmm. Gotta make that coin, though.
So in much the same way that the Book of Salt is a challenge to that legacy, like this book is very much about like, let's take a closer look at Bobert. And
let's see how what we know about Jesse James might not be true.
Yeah.
But also, you mentioned like Book of Salt presents Gertrude as still a very sympathetic, and like you described it as loving. And I think from what I remember of the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, it's been a while. From what I remember of the book, it's kind of similar. There is not a ton of deconstruction of Bobert, of Jesse as like trying to portray him as not good at what he does or not an interesting person. It's just like, this dude was weird and also he was a fucking racist.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a hero.
And like super a murderer.
Like super creepy. Like not a cool dude.
Killed a lot of people in nasty ways. Innocent people who were tellers at banks and stuff like that.
So there's like some of the shine taken off of the folklore, but there's still a certain amount of acknowledgement that this was a remarkable person in some way. Mm-hmm. So I think that is, I don't think that it's the intention of either book to completely tear down the legacy, but it is not a bad side effect if that happens.
Yeah, and it's an effort to complicate it and to tell a truer story, I think. Mm-hmm. The other sidebar that I want to put here is that I would not describe this as a queer book in the same vein as the Book of Salt, which is explicitly about a gay man, but there are heavy kind of homoerotic overtones.
Yes, there are.
Robert Ford and Jesse James's relationship. I have a quote here from towards the end of the book that I think there is a way that this at least this telling of the story kind of embodies that sense of like, you know, the trope of like, men can be intimate if they're dying in each other's arms or like enacting violence towards each other.
It's the only way they touch.
It kind of makes that case for it. This quote from the end of the book just fucking ruined my life. Robert Ford, said, "He was bigger than you can imagine, and he couldn't get enough to eat. He was hungry all the time. He ate all the food in the dining room, and then he ate all the plates and the glasses and the light off the candles. He ate all the air in your lungs and the thoughts right out of your mind. You'd go to him, wanting to be with him, wanting to be like him, and you'd always come away missing something." Bob looked at the girl with anger, and of course she was looking peculiarly at him. He said, "So now you know why I shot him."
That's such a good quote.
Me at both of these books, just wailing. It really has this sense of, it honors the legacy in a way because it says like, I am going to take you inside why someone would be drawn enough to this outlaw to like sign up at his gang and be pulled into his personal orbit. I mean, both of these stories are about people who are in the orbit of someone who is, by all accounts, like very magnetic, and had a big personality and a legacy around them, and yet also makes that person more human. Takes away the aspect of that as like a shiny veneer of like the folk hero, and basically just shows you how that person can be a deeply, deeply flawed human being, even if that's your relationship to them, even if that's
still true for you,
everyone's relationship with them, even if that's their enduring presence in the canon, you're still gonna get that.
You can distribute the truth of these people and the complexities of their personality and try and debunk the sort of folklore behind Jesse James being a Robin Hood figure. And you can do that with facts, right? You can sit there and say, actually, we have no proof that any of that happened, and this is what he did instead, and here's like an eyewitness account. But there's something that people respond much more to, and that's emotion and empathy. And by creating essentially a fictionalized person for the audience to empathize with, and that person basically represents a perspective of wow, I set this sentence up way fucked up. But the person is basically destabilizing the myth. I really like that, and I think that is possibly the best use of fictionalized nonfiction and historical narratives and stuff like that, because I can't tell you, like, one of my favorite authors is Sarah Vowell, and she doesn't write, strictly speaking, fictionalized nonfiction. She still writes in her own voice. She doesn't adopt any other persona, but her particular perspective is basically trying to challenge the popular narrative, and the way that she does that is by finding the humanity in it, like the weird things that not everybody knows, or strange anecdotes to try and ground it. She writes, my favorite book by her is probably Assassination Vacation, because she's obsessed with presidential assassinations, and she went on a tour of like historically significant places and museums and shit, and she brought her like little nephew along for a lot of it too. It's like, here's a fragment of Lincoln's skull. I'm going to look at that and talk about like what kind of a person Lincoln was. She has other books too, that are sort of in that same very strange, macabre, quirky, digging at the truffles of untold stories. And I really like that. And I think that that's why, like, the only type of historical narrative that will work for me is gonna be something that's challenging what we already know, because it's like, I already took like world history. If I wanted to know what people thought of Jesse James, I could just put on the History Channel or something. I already kind of know. Please tell me something new.
Jesse James is probably one of the wildest examples of like a person whose legacy is so different than the person they actually were. Look up, for your reference, like a list of the, not you, Amanda, but like, I'm giving a command to the listeners, a list of the Western movies and books based on his life.
And how completely not rooted in reality.
To do with it. Yeah, it's fascinating. I have a quote from Ron Hansen, author of The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford, about this that I think speaks to what you're saying, is that part of the reason I write historical fiction is that I think people are impoverished in their historical imagination, and I want to bring out what those earlier lives were like. And as a writer can own the past in a way that you can't own the present. If I write about contemporary circumstances, everybody thinks they know all about them already. Whereas there's sort of a suspension of disbelief that comes when you accept that I know more than you do about how trains ran in the 1870s. Which I think is really interesting, because he's speaking to both like the fact that there is a truth to be brought out, that we don't know what these lives were like, and that most people don't have the advanced degree in studying cowboys to have a better, perspective of what that was actually like. But at the same time, that as the writer, you get to make it up to a degree. And there's a tremendous power in that. And with great power comes great responsibility, that like, when you read something as lushly written as these two books, that is so thoroughly embedded in the ways that people talked and things that happened in those times, they really do have the power to make you feel like they're telling the truth. I could not, like, if you asked me as a casual reader of The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford, Bobert, what parts of that did he embellish and what parts did he not? I have no idea.
Yeah.
It all seems true to me.
You're like, seems legit.
I'm like, yeah, that's true, Ron. Thanks.
It's also, I mean, you're not going to be citing, like, you're not going to be on Jeopardy, like, ringing in questions like, this is the factual fact thing that I learned from this novel. But it is imbuing the way that you look at the past. And
yeah, it gives you an idea that you know them. Like, it really brings them out in a way where it's like, no, well, I know what Jesse James was like. He was an asshole.
Yeah.
I met him. Yeah. I met him in the book.
He was weird.
I also met my son Bobert there. And I think he's
Bobert?
fine. Yeah, Monique Truong actually had a similar quote that I really liked. As a historical novelist, I wouldn't characterize facts as a diminishment of a novel. Rather, it's the opposite. If my novels are building, then facts are like their steel framework. I would never dismantle the facts. It's more interesting to me to write around them and between them.
Yes. So one of the things when we were discussing that you were going to do this episode and sort of kibitzing about what I might be able to contribute having not read Book of Saul, I was making a list in my head of sort of historical revisionist fiction that I've read that's based on real people or at least real occurrences. And the first thing that I came up with was Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. And that I'm not going to talk about. But the other thing I came up with was Gore Vidal, who wrote he wrote a series in particular called The Narratives of Empire series. And it's essentially fictionalized novels that serve as biographies of famous people like Lincoln and Burr. I was trying to find if he had talked about the writing of that or how he researched it. One of the articles I read about it was on the New York Times, and the quote was, obviously, I have made up conversation, but whenever possible, I have used actual phrases of this speaker. And the New York Times article was just like, are we supposed to applaud that? I'm like, no, you don't get it. Like he's selling you on an idea and a humanization of, for example, Aaron Burr that challenges the popular narrative. It does not matter if he's writing verbatim or that he's making up exchanges and people from whole cloth. He's selling you an idea. And I thought that was really interesting, especially because here I take a swift left turn to talk about fucking Gore Vidal.
Thank you.
I'll get back on it, I swear. Pretty much everybody's familiar with the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical Hamilton, and that sort of reignited people's interest.
That was I feel like that was the least enthusiastic I've ever sounded about Hamilton, a show that I love. Hell yeah!
Yeah. But I feel like that was something that reignited a lot of people's interest in history, especially around the time of the Revolutionary War and the Founding Fathers and whatever. And like there's some criticism of how that musical paints like white slave owners, and it's an interesting revision of history, and there's some cool subversive stuff in there. But one of the things that it did was make Burr a more sympathetic figure. But arguably Gore Vidal did that first with his novel Burr, where basically the entire thing is Gore Vidal through the lens of Burr, who is telling his life story to his biographer, who's a dude named Schuyler, not related to
Those
Alexander
ones.
Hamilton's wife. But he's basically spending the entire novel kicking around a concept that the founding fathers were fucking pieces of shit and like craven and stupid and that Burr was like somehow a better and more evolved person. And like one of the things that Gore Vidal did is he really hated Jackson, in part because he was a disgusting slave owner, and that's fair, and everyone hates Andrew Jackson. He used the fiction in Burr as a cudgel to beat Jackson's long dead corpse with. And that Burr and Lincoln and his whole Narratives of Empire series sold like fucking hotcakes. It was generally well received, and it shifted the way that people conceived of biographies and historical fiction. And I think that it's really interesting that essentially it was a thought experiment. I mean, obviously Gore Vidal was interested in researching Aaron Burr and telling a fairly accurate to what actually happened story, but he was also really interested in making fun of George Washington.
Yeah.
And
spite is a powerful motivator.
It's so powerful. My point here was these stories that are challenging historical narratives are really important, because I don't think, for example, that the musical Hamilton could have been made without something like Burr. Mm-hmm. Anyway, yeah, one day I will figure out a fucking way to do a Gore Vidal episode, but that was my...
Make it happen, Amanda.
I'll figure it out.
Listenable podcast.
Really fucking... Anyone want me to take on Myra Breckenridge? I will.
Please tweet at us if you would like Amanda to do a Gore Vidal episode immediately.
Oh, God.
Because I would.
My next episode.
I think that's really... it comes up a lot in the romance genre where the two of us live. Because
our vacations homes are here.
Yeah, like historical revisionism is something that comes up a lot in a number of discussions of like the way we talk about dukes, the way we talk about various members of the peerage in ways that are not realistic but that represent something else, but also the ways that we do and don't challenge historical legacies. The fact that a lot of people are much more comfortable challenging the legacy of like there not being that many dukes to marry than there are people who are comfortable challenging like the concept of there being people of color in Europe, or rather the idea that there weren't somehow.
Yeah.
That you can't have a queer story that ends happily before the year 2000.
This is accurate, but everything outside of it can't be.
I think that the idea that if you are, writing the people who are in the shadows of these stories and the people who are in the margins, that is revisionism of the like what if the Civil War happened in space type, rather than a reflection of something that is true. I think that is what these particular stories do really, really powerfully, is they not only tell you that story, the untold story, but they also tell you why that story was buried. Like, the Book of Salt goes deep into like the fact that Ben, the narrator, is never going to have his story told because he literally doesn't speak the language super well in the country that he's in. Nobody is listening to him. Nobody hears his voice. It shows you that he can't even afford to. The book is framed in part around photographs that Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas took together. They not only had many photographs taken together, but they had their portraits painted. They filled their home with them. He can't even afford to have a picture taken of himself, and he's in the background of one picture of them. And so it takes you deep into not only knowing this person now, but also knowing the mechanics of society that have erased him from that narrative. I think to a lesser extent, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford does that as well, by showing you the flip side of a long told story, taking you into the mind of a 20-year-old kid who is starstruck over some famous outlaw and then gets very scared and very uppity and murders him. What happens if you treat that character with the same level of attention as you do the famous outlaw? There is a really cool character buried in there.
There's also something to be said, and I'm bringing up Sarah Vowell again, but one of the reasons she's so obsessed with presidential assassinations is because you have to be a very remarkable person to think that you can be a president. You have to be a very remarkable person to think that you can kill a president.
Yeah.
It's like a coin of delusion. On one side is president, on the other side is assassin.
One of the interesting things that the book points out is that President Garfield was assassinated shortly before Jesse James was. And those two things were kind of treated on the same level.
Well, I imagine for Confederates, they would not want to see their folk hero killed.
Yeah.
Ugh. One of the things that delights me is when you confront someone who's really into the cowboy myth with the reality that most cowboys were
men of color, and also some of them were women.
Yeah. And then it wasn't, when I say sexy or attractive, I don't mean everyone thought it was a really cool way to live. Something about the ruggedness and the struggle of having to live in less than ideal conditions is attractive to some folks. I don't understand it. I don't even like camping very much. But, people are drawn to that narrative of you stand alone against the elements and you're a white man with a hat. Yeah. And they really don't like it when you're like, hey, that actually isn't.
Oh, you wrangle those steer. You ride them.
You don't have butt sores.
Cowboy butt sores.
Why isn't anyone confronting the reality of cowboy butt sores? I'm sure of course they had good methods to deal with it because this was the reality that they faced. Butt sores. Yeah, we were talking again in the pre-prep of this episode about historical revisionism. One of the things that, like you said, is romance readers and writers. I cannot get over the fact that people are still releasing sympathetic Nazi romances in 2019. They're still pushing that narrative. We didn't have enough.
Yeah, I think that speaks to with great power comes great responsibility. Once again, you can use this kind of power for evil.
You can. It is not always just to be subversive. Is a Nazi romance subversive?
It is and it isn't.
Oh, and then another example. This is less specifically one person, but sort of the true crime genre and America's in particular obsession with serial killers, of which I share, and how that has contributed to a mythologizing of serial killers, instead of just being these are pieces of shit.
These are pretty
these are terrible
awful human beings,
and a lot of them are really boring and they don't have anything interesting or worthwhile or particularly scintillating to say. They're just I murder and mutilate women. Cool.
Yeah.
And yet I again am really interested in true crime and have read a lot of crime fiction, so I'm not saying that you can't write a cool story that sort of fictionalizes I don't know, Jack the Ripper. There's one. It's old. And that's been done 10,000 times, but I feel like at this point, since we all kind of know the narrative of Jack the Ripper, why don't we do something interesting, like talk about his victims, or talk about like people who tried to catch him, or talk about, you know, the effect that it had on London, instead of just spooky man.
This is an interesting thing to pull, but I have to say, I think my favorite semi-fictionalization of Jack the Ripper is from Assassin's Creed Syndicate.
The DLC, the Ripper DLC.
The Assassin's Creed Syndicate DLC, which is a framing of that is actually centered in part around the sex workers that he was attacking and murdering, and that is really focused on shaming and bludgeoning men who hurt women. Yeah. Which is the only appropriate framing of anything to do with Jack the Ripper, and is notable for being the only video game I can think of that has an actual mechanic where you drag violent men away from women and drag them through the streets, shaming them.
That was so good.
It's the best mechanic any video game has had, and I wish they all had it.
Make every video game that, please.
The one other thing, I feel like we're close to wrapping up here, but one other thing that I wanted to throw in there just because it tickled me, that I learned from The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. Bobert Ford, was that Oscar Wilde was staying like next door to Jesse James. Not
even a mile.
He was passing by on one of his tours of the US, his lecture tours, and stayed in a house like right down the street from where Jesse James was murdered, like a week afterwards, and wrote to a friend about it. And that is just so wild to me. It's wild to me.
God.
If you want to be emotional, read about how much like cowboys loved Oscar Wilde.
Oscar Wilde's tours of America, especially like the American South and the American West, are so fucking heartwarming and weird. One day we will do our Oscar Wilde episode.
My favorite quote of all time was something from an article about like, because like long hair and big hats and fancy clothes were seen as like signs of masculinity in the South in that period, and like kind of in the mythos, like he was seen as kind of like a big bad outlaw man. Yeah, like because he had like long hair and fancy hats.
Oscar.
It makes me so happy.
We also kicked around the idea of discussing the movie Wild with Stephen Fry and Jude Law.
Yes.
As an example of like fictionalized historical revisionism. But it didn't really, like, Wild doesn't quite do anything that we don't know about in the popular Wild narrative.
It's very sympathetic, which at a certain point would have been subversive. But I think in the year 2019, hopefully most of us are sympathetic to Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, and his trial. Oh, Oscar. Man, that is shockingly, like, that movie aged pretty well. I watched it a couple years back and I was like, oh, okay, all right. Also, Jude Law was fucking beautiful in it. Good lord.
The fact that no one cast Jude Law at that age to play Dorian Gray is an affront
it's a shame.
God.
It's a shame. Like the shot of him at I think it was the premiere for Lady Windermere's Fan, I think. And it was when like Oscar was doing the rounds, like milling about. Literally, he looks over and sees Bosie, played by Jude Law, and it's like,
yeah.
He's just fucking staggeringly beautiful. I'm like, damn it, that's him, that's Dorian. Go film it now.
They didn't do it. They didn't do it for us.
Yeah, that was a short window of being able to do that too. Like, I love Jude Law's good face, but like, he can't do that now.
No.
He's not a beautiful angelic twink anymore.
No.
How very on brand.
And this is no longer a podcast anymore because it's time to wrap up.
It's time to wrap up.
That was a good segue. Do you think, was that a good segue? How would you rate that? 1 to 10?
10 being Jude Law in Wild and 1 being Jude Law in...
What a mean thing are you going to say about Jude Law?
Fantastic Beasts 2.
Okay, that's fair.
No offense. I like his casting, but that movie needs to be shot in the street or in the back.
Yeah. Be a coward if you need to. Just shoot that movie.
Bobert.
I mean, don't shoot it. Don't make it.
Exactly. Don't shoot it. Burn the reels. I would say your segue was about a 6.
I'll take it.
It wasn't Bosie Douglas.
Is that I'm imagining that's not quite at the level of like Jude Law in
Talented Mr. Ripley?
No,
Talented Mr. Ripley is like a 9.
No, one where he plays the hot android.
Oh, Gattaca?
No.
I can't think of what the fuck. Hot android.
I'm about to Google on my work computer. Jude Law, robot gigolo.
AI, Jesus, I forgot that existed. I can't believe my brain went Gattaca with that. Really? I don't know. Me trying to understand Jude Law's filmography.
Not 6 isn't that hot because he's pretty hot in that movie, but
Jude Law in the first Sherlock Holmes movie.
okay, I'll take that.
Yeah, still pretty cute.
I don't know that it was effective as a segue, and then now that I'm just thinking about all the various hot angles of Jude Law's face, but if you'd like to continue the conversation with us about that, or this podcast,
Or your son Bobert,
or my son Bobert,
and the meltdown I had about him.
or Amanda's meltdown, make that trend. Make a hashtag of that, make it trend.
Bobert Ford chant.
You can find us on Twitter at RedPenPod or at our personal Twitters, which in my case is at Austin Chanted.
Mine's at Amanda H. Jean.
Or you can give us money on Patreon.
Please.
That was going to be a smooth segue into that, but I'm not good with them today. So I'll just say, if you like the show and you've got a couple bucks just burning a hole in your pocket, and you would like to chip them into our production, it really helps us out. And also you can get some super sweet bloopers
And bonus
content. And if you pledge at certain levels, you can get us to talk about random shit for you, which we would love to do.
Clearly.
And also if you're interested in advertising at the program, you can always email us at redpenpod@gmail.com. And as always, if you love something, cut it up. Please put in your weird giggle.
What's kind of Muppet-like?
Yeah.